My name is Saskia Schmidt. I'm Director of Education at the Noyes Museum of Art, and I welcome you to a lecture by Iain, who is Director of the Advocacy Project. It's a project that works with communities that are in varying degrees of distress and under a lot of strain, poverty, war, disease. They go all around the world and they work with these people to help ameliorate their situation. Part of that project is the Advocacy Quilts, which is what he will be talking about with you today.
Thank you very much, Saskia. So I'm really delighted to be here today. It's a special day, obviously, for lots of different reasons, but I'm very grateful to you all for the opportunity to explain a little bit about the work that we do. In our small non-profit, we're based in Washington, and as Saskia said, we work with community-based groups in different countries. We really are a human rights group. These community groups are all facing, as Saskia said, different degrees of pressure. They're all marginalized. Many of them have been directly affected by war and conflict. And as part of this, we help them to express themselves through quilts. And we call this program Advocacy Quilting. It's been going now for 3 or 4 years, but I have brought over 2, which we will be referring to in the lecture today. They are quite striking, very carefully chosen for different reasons, which I think will become clearer as we go along. Now, I should say that these quilts do not belong to us. We are the curators. We look after them and we show them on behalf of our partners. This is very much of a partnership, and I want to make that clear at the beginning. Also, all of the quilts that we'll be referring to today are profiled on our website. And every single artist who contributed is on our website. So I hope you'll be able to go there. I'll give you the address at the end of the lecture. Take a look, particularly those specialists who are working on quilting per se. Now, before I get cracking, let's see if there's anything else. This does seem to be, by the way, a wonderful audience. And the fact that we have some quilters in the audience is music to my ears, because you guys can serve as technical assistants when I trip up over the technicalities. Okay, so let's move on. Now today, obviously, is a very special day and a very sober one, particularly for this country. And I think that the first manifestations of grief that we saw after 9/11 were very interesting. And of course, you saw this all over New York City. I'm sure many of you saw this. And I think 3 things are going on in this photograph. First of all, there's the act of memory. You're remembering people who were lost, particularly family members. Secondly, you're doing it through photographs. There's nothing more, there is no better way to connect with somebody than through a visual image, particularly a photograph. And thirdly, there is some kind of invitation to act. Now, the action may be as simple as finding out what happened to your relative, or it may be more dramatic. And we're going to see all 3 of these things in play during this lecture. In terms of precedents, I think probably the best one and the one that most of you will connect to is the AIDS Memorial Quilt, which of course is a massive project. And you see it here laid out in front of the Capitol in Washington, D.C., commemorating and remembering people who died during the AIDS epidemic, but also urging politicians to take action. Some of you maybe are too young to remember the beginning of the AIDS epidemic back in the early 1980s, but it was terrifying. And the way that the families of family members, relatives, organized, mobilized, and then advocated for change, for money to be spent on AIDS research and the rest of it is really quite inspiring. The precedents, I think, for our presentation are numerous. But I'm going to start with Chile in 1973, after the coup which displaced Allende, Salvador Allende. And about 3,000 people during that coup disappeared. All of them were killed. And their relatives remembered them by making arpilleras. I have one here. Don't know whether you can see that. This was made by the mother of somebody who disappeared. And it actually tells the story of the hueca. This is the dance that the relatives do. They still do it in Santiago. And they would pin a little panuela, a little white piece of cloth, with a photo or a picture or just a commemoration of their missing relative. I don't know if any of you know the Sting the song by Sting, They Dance Alone. That is about the hueca in Chile. But it's an expression of loss through art. In this case, they use wool and embroidery. Now we come forward to Argentina in 1976. These are the mothers of the Plaza de Mayo, the very famous organization, again, relatives who lost children in the dictatorship. The photograph on the left is a young woman called Monica Mignoni. I wrote a book, actually, about the disappearances some years ago, and I featured Monica's story. The mothers walk around the Plaza de Mayo, which is the main square in Buenos Aires, and they wear these white scarves, the panuelas. And again, you see the same thing. You see the same. It's an act of expression, of remembrance, but also protest. And I think all of this plays into this concept of advocacy quilting. Now we move forward to Bosnia. At the end of the Bosnian War in Europe, the massacre at Srebrenica, in which over 8,000 men and boys were killed by the Bosnian Serbs. The town surrendered, everybody surrendered, the men were separated from the women, and the men were all killed in one of the largest massacres in Europe since the end of the Second World War, which we see on the left, the women being expelled. They were just kicked out and forced into a neighboring part of Bosnia while their relatives were being killed. How did they remember this? Well, again, they remembered it through expression, through textiles, fabric. In this case, they very simply wrote the name of their relative on the fabric, and they take that out and they stand. It's very dignified, and it's an act of protest, but it's also an act of remembrance. Now, after those women were expelled from the site of the massacre in Srebrenica, they moved to a town called Tuzla, and many of them were given knitting by the United Nations because they were totally traumatized, and so, you know, that nobody knew quite what to do with them, but we gave them knitting needles and they gave them wool and they started to knit, and it proved to be very, very therapeutic. And through the knitting, they became very interested in textiles, and they set up a weaving center. The aid agencies gave them some looms. Other aid agencies gave them a house, and they have this incredible place at BOSFAM. Now, BOSFAM is a women's organization. It's short for the Bosnian Family, BOSFAM. And they were one of the first partners that we took on when we started our nonprofit in Washington. And we see here one of the mothers, one of the relatives, at work on the loom in BOSFAM House. And you can see the quality of their carpets is really quite impressive. We visited them in 2002, 2003. We brought some of their carpets to the States, and we found it quite interesting. People really related to the story of these women who'd lost relatives in this horrific massacre, but were doing something constructive. And they were turning out these wonderful products. We got a lot of publicity. We're in the newspapers, and we helped them to sell quite a lot of their products. And through that, we began to suggest to them that they might want to use their weaving skills to tell the story of what had happened to them and their loved ones at this massacre. And over here on the right, the larger carpet that is hanging is one of the products. The way they did it was very simple. They would each make a small carpet square, that carried the name of the relative who had been killed and a decoration. Very straightforward. They're Muslims, and so they're not trying to replicate natural objects. These are abstract patterns. Now, the photo to the bottom left that you see is a photograph of Alan Parrish, who was 15 when he was killed in the Srebrenica massacre. We've done a ton of work on this incident, and it is still to this day, I think, absolutely horrifying. One of the things that is particularly sad about it is that the women were just kicked out with the clothes on their back. So they did not have the photographs, the visual memory, if you like, of their relatives. And this is one of the very few photographs that exists of Alem. I think it was his aunt who made this square over here. They have made a series of memorial quilts, 15, each of them commemorating a group of people who were killed in the massacre. So you have the children's quilt, you have the teacher's quilt, you have the women's quilt, and so on and so forth. They are all very, very striking because partly they're so simple. Now, if you look at this quilt here, this was the third or fourth in the series. This was commissioned by Bosnian families in the United States, part of the Bosnian diaspora, who had lived in Srebrenica and had sought refuge in the States during the war and been accepted as refugees. And you can see there's an entire family, the Sinonovic family, 5 of them who were all killed in that massacre and who were all remembered in this memorial quilt. After Bosnia, we went to another of our partner organizations in Guatemala. This is somewhat similar to the Bosnians. It's a group, a large group, that represents many, many families who lost relatives during a whole series of massacres in Guatemala in 1982 and 1983. And we suggested the idea to them. And they also came up with a quilt, which was actually made out of little carpets like the Bosnians. This is a picture of one of the weavers, Isabel Chen. You can see they're using the same approach. This is the name of her grandmother, Juliana. She's got little designs here. They're actually meant to be mountain lions that were common in that area. It's, again, a very simple quilt. It's powerful, and so, you know, after 2 of these quilts, we began to think, well, this is something that really people like. It's a way of expressing themselves. It can tell their story. So we began to suggest it to other partner organizations. And over the last 2 or 3 years, a number of these groups have produced squares for the quilts. Now, most of the quilts have been assembled in this country by expert quilters. We'll come on to that in a moment. Some of them, like the Bosnian quilt over there, are put together in situ in the country themselves. What we're going to look at now is a series of images, which is the way that some of these quilters have expressed themselves. And I should warn you, I think Saskia made this point earlier, some of the images are quite violent. For example, this one. Now, after Guatemala, with some trepidation, we decided to suggest this model of advocacy quilting to a group of women in the Congo that is one of the most vulnerable and the most damaged, I think, communities that we work with. Our partner organization down there takes women who've been raped in the war into centers for 3 months, helps them to recover, and then accompanies them home. And for obvious reasons, this is a very, very, very difficult program, and extremely, extremely difficult to work with, but I have to say very successful as well. Over the last 4 or 5 years, we've helped hundreds of women return. They've reunited with their husbands. But of course, the act, what they went through, the violence that they suffered is extreme and very, very difficult to describe. Well, they have tried to describe it. And over here, and I hope you'll get a good look at this, this is the second quilt that's on show, is one of 6 quilts that have been assembled from squares that they produced down there. They produced the embroidery, and the panels, the squares, were then brought up and assembled in this country. Now, what strikes one immediately about this is the violence of the image. We did not suggest the images to these women. We left it up to them. We said, you can describe whatever you want. This is your form of expression. And they took to it with gusto. I think one of the reasons is there's nobody else there who gives a damn about what their situation is. There are no lawyers that represent them. There are no police that protect them. Their own soldiers who are meant to protect them are actually responsible for many of the rapes. So nobody listens to them. And having an audience is the first form, or the first essential prerequisite to some form of recovery. This is an act of resistance. In a situation like those women find themselves in, actually telling their story this graphically is itself an act of resistance. And I think that's what we're looking at. Now, I hope you'll take a look at some of the images afterwards, because they are extreme, and I mean extreme. Saskia, I think we had to turn this quilt over when it was on show at the museum. But again, that is their prerogative. That's the story they want to tell. Not all of the Congo quilts are that violent. Some of them show, you know, babies and women and cooking and all that sort of stuff. But 2 or 3 of them are extremely violent, and that's what we're seeing here. This quilt was made by a group of widows in the Masai part of Kenya, in western Kenya. They're called the Rehema Widows Group. And it describes another very unpleasant practice known as, sometimes known as female genital mutilation or genital cutting. And again, I hope you can see this, but it's extremely explicit. Now, it's illegal, this practice in Kenya, but it still happens, and all of the widows who contributed to this quilt, including Parakwo, whose photograph you see over there, had themselves been through the practice. The quilt is, the panels are interesting because they're made with beads. So the story is actually told through Masai beads, which is a very traditional form of illustration and art in the Masai area. Show a little bit of video here. We have 3 quilts which are huge, and they comprise actually paintings onto cloth which tell the story of a medical condition known as uterine prolapse. This occurs in Nepal very widely. Something like 600,000 or 700,000 women are thought to have it. It is very unpleasant. It happens when the woman's uterus basically falls out of her body as a result of all kinds of bad stuff: nutrition, hard work, violence, and, as you'll see in the photograph, midwives who do not know their stuff. They abuse the women when they're pregnant. Many of them are married very young, at the age of 15, 16, so their bodies are really too immature to take the trauma of childbirth, if you like, and the midwives who are untrained make it worse. And all of this puts pressure on the uterus. So about 3 years ago, one of our volunteers who was working with this group in Nepal suggested the idea to a group of women who'd been through prolapse and said, why don't you try and tell your story if you're interested? Other people have done it in the Congo, Guatemala, and again, they took to it. They really enjoyed it. I say they enjoyed the process, they didn't enjoy the prolapse. See if I can bring up a little bit of video here so that it'll give you an idea. Here we go.
ओकरा पाट अथी प्लासेंटा पुरन रह जाय छै भीतरे में त ओकरा खींचे छै पाठे घर के त ओकरा दमय छै ओइ कारण से खून निकलै छै ओकरा नीचा ब्लीडिंग आ त बच्चा भेलै आ बच्चा भेल छै साइड में बच्चो छै काम त बहुत करै छै से कहियो न सबटा काम करै छै स्कूल में पढ़ेबो करै छै से कहियो न स्कूल में पढ़ेबो करै छै बच्चा सब के पालै छै यानी 2टा बच्चो जन्मेलिए ससुर के सेवा करै छै यानी हमरा खेतों रोप जाइछे हमरा मगर हम श्रीमान लोग जाका हेला नहीं करे छे हमरा लोग के बहुते महिला के देखे छिए घर से बाहर नहीं निकल दै छे बोलू नहीं जा देबे से कहि के कते के पढ़ैयो नहीं जा दै छे छोरा छोरी में भेदभाव करे छे बेटी सब के कहे छे सरकारी में पर बेटा के पठवे छे बोर्डिंग में तै कारण बेटा के निक निक खाय ले दै छे बेटी के घर में राखे छे काम और करबे छे नहीं पढ़वा लिखवा दै छे बाल विवाह कर दै छे 10-12 बरस में बियाह कर दै छे ओकरा बच्चा भए गेल तुरंत पाठे घर झड़ गेल बहुत समस्या है महिला सब को बहुत पुरुषे सब बहुत दुख दै छे कि पुरुषे सब ने आगा बढ़ दै छे महिला सब को
So that's quite interesting, isn't it? She's referring, you probably saw that, and maybe you can see that. You see the blood coming out here from the woman who has prolapse. It's a little bit disorganized, that interview, but she packs quite a lot in there. And central to the interview is the notion of discrimination against girls in favor of boys. It's the boys who get sent to the good schools. It's the girls who are kept back to work in the home. That also applies to food. The girls are denied proper food. So there's a lot of inbuilt discrimination, and it is no surprise that suicide is the largest killer of women of reproductive age in Nepal. Their lives are terrible in many places. But you see, that little video, the volunteer who worked with that group took videos of all of the women who made squares for the quilt. We want to give them the chance to tell their story. That's what we're trying to do with our work, is to give them the chance to express themselves as they want. I mean, we can guide them, we can help them, but it's their decision. And we want them to emerge from the anonymity of poverty, if you like. And that in itself, as I said at the start, is an act of empowerment. This is a rather horrible issue. Child sacrifice in Uganda was something of a surprise to me to know that it is as widespread as it is. We had huge reservations about making a quilt out of this, but we suggested it to the partner organization, and they got a group of people together who had all lost children and relatives to sacrifice. And you see here, Anna Ngula made this panel. It's embroidered in remembrance of her niece who was killed by witch doctors. It's a very sad story, and it's on the increase in Uganda. Many of the major infrastructural projects, there's a lot of superstition there. You know, they'll call up a witch doctor, they'll pinch a child from the fields while the parents aren't watching, or take it off, chop the child up and bury some of the body parts under the buildings. Good, supposedly good luck. We heard that story many times. It is not for us as a northern organization, obviously, to interfere in other people's culture. There's a fine line to be drawn. So the volunteer who went down to work on that was African American. She was extremely sensitive. She wasn't pushing anything on these people, but once again, they chose to make that statement, and we have to respect that. This little girl, Kajal, up top right, is one of several children who live in garbage, or used to live in garbage, in India, in Delhi. The partner organization that we work with, Chintan, it's a wonderful organization, helps waste pickers to leave the life of waste. It promotes proper recycling. It takes the kids out of the waste and puts them into school. And our volunteer found a bunch of these kids while they were in school. She was actually very resourceful. She went out and found a whole bunch of clothes that had been discarded, cut up the clothes into pieces of cloth, gave them to kids and said, okay, over to you. Of course, like any kids anywhere, they took their magic marker and they went at it. The images themselves are not particularly significant or, again, violent as such, but it's a dire situation, and I think it's a poignant quote from that little girl. This describes a practice known as kamlaris. These are Nepali children who are sold by their parents as a result of poverty into domestic service at the age of 5 or 6. And they then live for many years as effectively slaves. It's very well known in Nepal. It's practiced in the Midwest of the country. And we work with 2 or 3 organizations which are real heroes. They've been lobbying on this issue. They've been pushing. They've forced laws, and undoubtedly changes are underfoot. But the practice still continues. 8% of the Nepali workforce are children, even though it is illegal to employ children under the age of 14. So one can ask why the law is being so deliberately flouted. And part of the problem, obviously, is poverty. Parents need their children. They need them in the house. They need them to help. But this is exploitation, pure and simple. We did ask kids to make a quilt or to make panels, and once again they went at it with a magic marker. This is a very sort of plaintive and poignant quote that is actually on one of the panels. I have to always cook and they will scold me. I cannot study well. Oh God, help me. Now there's a lot that can be done on this. There's a lot that is being done to help the children leave this form of labor and go into school, and that really is what our program's all about. But as you can see, these children are enormously appealing and also in need. Here's something very different. These are the Roma in Europe, and Claudia Bacuta was originally from Romania. She was expelled from Romania. She came to France. She was expelled back to Romania from France. We caught her when she was back in France. A group of Roma women who made a splendid quilt about 3 years ago with help from the Council of Europe. This is actually a truly spectacular design. It shows inequality between men and women in the Roma. And again, you know, you have this theme of discrimination against women. This is another group of Roma who put a quilt together in the Czech Republic. It's a rather complicated design. On the left, you see some of the pressures on Roma in Europe from neo-Nazis and violence. You see 2 baseball bats there and a hand grenade at the top, and then you have the emblem of the Council of Europe in the middle, and then on the right there's some positive stuff about peace and reconciliation. So it's a rather it's a different kind of panel, isn't it? It's more intellectual. We call it the Violence and Reconciliation panel, and Zanita was one of the artists. Again, something totally different. A woman in northern Uganda who was damaged by a mine after the Lord's Resistance Army rebellion. And she is remembered that simply by embroidering one of those little frog mines about this size. Most of them are made out of plastic, extremely dangerous because they get dislodged during the water, the floods. They can move around. You can't pick them up through mine detectors. A lot of people get wounded by them in the global south, in countries which have been through conflict. And she simply, that's her name, Monica Paloya, and she's simply written landmine. And for me, that's a powerful image. And here's yet another one, river gypsies in Bangladesh. Their problem is very interesting. They live on islands in the river, and at night, people from the local corporation come in and they pinch the sand for their buildings. It's illegal, but they do it, and when the villagers resist, they get beaten up, and that's what we see depicted over here in this panel. You can just see the picture of the artist Mukta, who made this quite beautiful quilt. This is an exquisite piece of artistry. So a few slides on the process. Here are some of the women who were responsible for making this quilt on the left. You remember we had that very violent image earlier on. We didn't really know what to expect when we took this idea into the Congo. It was basically a question of going in to one of these centers, explaining, were they interested, were they not? Well, they were. And as you can see, it's a real family business. So this woman is embroidering a panel, a little kid is over there. They're all doing it together. I think you have an expression, don't you, American quilters, bitch and stitch, isn't that what they do? They sort of sit around and talk and they do their stitching, and so that was certainly going on there. There was a team that supported them without any question, without any doubt. We had to buy fabric for the squares, and we found that the thread broke, the local thread, Congolese thread, so we had to go to Burundi, which is the next country. We bought up all the thread that was available in Bujumbura, so that wasn't very good. Then we had to go to Rwanda, so it was quite a process. Down here, if any of you would like to volunteer for our fellowship program, this is the kind of thing that goes on, very little electricity. This is one of our volunteers from the University of Wisconsin, actually writing her blogs by candlelight. We hired a local artist called Bayombi, who makes a living by writing graffiti on walls. So he would come and sit next to the artist, and he'd pick up a little piece of cloth, and he'd have a pencil, and he'd say, okay, well, tell me your story. What's your story? And she'd say, well, I remember I was going through the fields one day, and the soldiers came. Oh, yeah, okay. Well, how about this? No, it wasn't like this. It was more like that. Okay. So between them, they come up with a design. That would take about 20 minutes, and then he would hand that to the woman, and then she would get going. Up there is one of the local organization representatives, a very, very nice woman called Sango, who knows how to sew and use a needle, and she would give technical advice. But, and this is really one of the mysteries for me after doing this work now for 2 or 3 years, many of the women had actually never used a needle in their life. And yet they managed to produce these extraordinary patterns and designs. How did they do it? This is actually up here, a picture of me looking rather stupid with a professor of art at Keene University trying to explain the mystery. And we really couldn't explain it. How is it possible that women who have never been to school, who've never used a needle, who have no basic knowledge of sewing or needlework or darning, can produce something as beautiful as that? Great mystery to me. But it must say something about art and the way art is created. You do not need to be a specialist or a professional to produce something that is artistic. At least I would say so. Quilting is enormously therapeutic, as we said earlier. Remember I told you earlier that when those women escaped from the massacre, the first thing they did was they gave them knitting needles. What you see is that when women come together as a group, they've all gone through the same experience, they help themselves out, and that is tremendously therapeutic. I took this photograph as part of a quilting group. And here we see the same thing again with those women, the Roma women we talked about earlier in France. They had a hell of a good time. I mean, every now and then they'd have huge arguments over boyfriends and what else. But basically, this is a communal activity, and that is part of the process of recovery. It's very, very important. When we go into that camp in the Congo, when our partner organization from SOS Femmes en Danger, the group that does this incredible work, when they go in and they find women, or they're working with women who have just been raped, they don't give them psychosocial support, they put them with other women. They get it out, they talk about it, being with other women is the best form of recovery. And international aid agencies would be well to learn that. One of the kind of byproducts of this is that local culture is being, I think, preserved and protected. And we see this here in a quilt from Morocco, from women in the Atlas Mountains who are actually Berbers. Amazigh was before the Arabs came to Morocco. She has used a pattern, which is a Berber pattern called the eye. And over here, in a panel from, that's the panel there that you see. It's a simple design. I don't know what it means. This one definitely has a meaning. The eye is a well-known symbol. Some of these symbols, these Berber symbols, remember fertility and farming and other essential activities. I don't know what that means, but it obviously has been handed down. And so to some extent, the quilting project, I think, is helping to encourage and preserve local culture, which is important. We have a huge issue over identifying people who have been through an extremely traumatic experience. We've thought and talked about this endlessly. And there are many NGOs that do not identify women particularly who have been raped or who've been trafficked. They think it re-stigmatizes. We've talked about this, as I said, with our local partner. We leave it up to them. But of the 120 women who produced squares for that quilt, that Congo quilt, every single one insisted that her photo be used and that she be identified. And they signed a written waiver to that effect. And again, it goes to show that, you know, these women have no other way of making a protest. This is a form of resistance. And of course, it goes very closely with demanding justice and accountability. Now, these quilts are a tool of advocacy. We're the Advocacy Project. They are Advocacy Quilts. That means that they were made for a purpose. And I'm just going to, again, pause a little bit here and give you a little bit of a video, if I can. The Hardy quilt comes to America. These are the women, the quilters, who made that Congo quilt that we can see over there.
Okay, what's going on in this particular quilt, it's one of 3 that the Advocacy Project asked us to work on. And I think the theme in this one is village life, largely. But we're getting a whole group of people together to sew the fabrics that we've been provided together into something like a unified whole that allows the people in East Congo to tell their story.
Well, this is this is theme 1 with all the fighting, and you know, that's sort of hard. We like the other ones better, I think, with the babies and some of that stuff. But these are all the men and the guns and the kids being taken. So, you know, I mean, even though we know it happens, I guess it brings it home to us when we're sewing on it like this.
These have been pressed and they have been bordered. We're trimming them down now. So we're getting ready now to start the second panel. So these are just getting trimmed down to the final size to go into the quilt top. So our goal is to have all of these blocks completed, bordered, and ready to sew at least into the panels by the end of the day.
I will get some over to the thing that struck me when I was working on paper to make the embroidery fit in the space that we had was how much more potent the story is when you've got something from those women's hands telling their very own story. There's terrific power in these. Even these more pastoral pictures of women with children or nursing their children, it's very personal what that means to them. And then when you get into the blocks that are telling much more violent stories, you feel the anger and the despair and just frustration and the difficulty of a life with the effects of the war and the particular weapons, which are the sexual assault and abduction, the disruption in the community and the social fabric, and how damaging that is, and how precisely it works as a weapon, and how hurt people are by that. It's just very powerful to work with those pictures and be, smoothing them out and making them ready for a quilt for other people to look at, and you're handling something that a woman has made with her own hands.
It does bring home to us a different perspective on other countries, especially the not so forward-moving countries, and what goes on there, which we don't. It's not even really in the news every day here, so when we see such a up-close and personal representation of what's going on, it's really eye-opening. And we're happy to be able to do this, what we think is sort of a little thing, to help bring such a wide perspective to what goes on there, because this is something we do every day, sewing borders on blocks, but this is a whole new thing to do it for a real purpose like this. The patterns are so vibrant that we are putting them together without any thought ahead of time, really. We're just kind of piecing them by size, and if you look on the board where we have them hanging some of the blocks, it just is amazing that it all comes together, even though we don't even plan. It's the colors of the fabrics that we were given that's really bringing out the block itself. It's really beautiful when you're done. It'll be great.
They're amazing.
So you would say the quality of the stitching is...
Oh, wonderful. Look at this. Look at how even. It's hard to do this. They're doing it without embroidery hoops. They're doing it without all of these, thousands of little tools that we have here in the United States. And it's gorgeous.
Quilts become a document of industrialization, of women in the workplace, of women using technology, the sewing machines, and the transformation that happened in the world. And quilts have been used for political purposes since the beginning of time. And it's a very old tradition and really worldwide as we're getting to understand it better. And one way or another, these I think will be important things to belong to those people so that they can say this is the time we went through and this is how we told our story. And maybe it will help them, rebuild when it's time to build.
There are women in this world who suffer so much more than we can even imagine. This is a small job that we do if we can get their message out to everybody else.
So, it's a very nice little film, I think you'll agree. Most of the quilts that we have were made in this country, assembled by people like our friends from the Faithful Circle Quilting Guild in Maryland, and Barbara Barber, who is a very well-known quilter in this country, who put together 2 quilts from Belize. You see her here. And what you see in that film is very interesting, that through working with these quilts, those women in the Maryland begin to understand some of the horrors that have been perpetrated in the Congo and some of the pressures on women in the Congo. So actually making the quilts becomes a form of education. I mean, very directly, we love to show quilts to students because people are always interested and because the stories associated with the quilts are so incredible. This is one of our group, Laura, at Keene University, another college, as you know, university in New Jersey, where our quilts were shown last year. Occasionally, just occasionally, we will work with celebrities. This is Diane von Furstenberg, who has supported the project in the Congo. We gave her one of the quilts in gratitude. She was very pleased with that. Of course, she works with fabric and again has told us that the way that these women use fabric and color is quite remarkable. Diane is very nice and is certainly an inspiration to many young women. But again, what does it mean for these quilts to be a tool of advocacy? We're only exploring this. We don't have many people in our group, and obviously there's a limit to what we can achieve, but every now and then we'll see something very interesting. This is one of the Congo quilts, the Srebrenica memorial quilts, being used at the trial of the man who was responsible for the Srebrenica massacre, Radovan Karadzic, a very, very bad man. And some of the women whose husbands he had personally ordered killed came to his trial and used the memorial quilt to underscore the importance of remembering the rights of victims, claiming accountability. This is a more indirect form of protest by a Mayan woman in Belize who produced a panel for one of 2 quilts warning of the impact of oil exploration on the rainforest. And the way that they did this was by making squares illustrating wildlife in the rainforest. This is quite exquisite. This is a fabulous, fabulous quilt, as you can see. And Paulina and the other Belize artists, unlike the Congo artists, did have quite a lot of experience of embroidery. This is one of our favorite quilts. It's certainly one of the most unmanageable. This is a group of women who live in a slum in Uganda, in Kampala, who are trying to get rid of plastic bags in the slum. And the way that they do this is they collect straws, drinking straws, and they recycle them, they flatten them, and then they use them to weave bags, and then they sell the bags. Well, we asked them a couple of years ago if they would actually make us a straw quilt, which they did. They took 10,000 straws and they wove them into a big quilt. They took bark from the tubu tree, they flattened the bark, and then they painted a series of paintings onto this bark paper, which are then put onto the quilt. It's really quite dramatic. And this illustration actually shows the women collecting these straws. So the whole straw is actually a statement against plastic pollution, and we're very big on that. Climate change in Vietnam, I mean, this model can be used for any number of different issues. Every six or seven times a year in Vietnam, in this low-lying area to the north of Vietnam, people get, the typhoons come in. And of course, people with disability are the first to be affected. They're immobile, they can't move quickly. This is one of two artists who made a series of designs for a quilt. You can see two people on the roof, and you can see the floodwaters rising. And this is taken from the quilt itself. It's actually rather gorgeous. You see it through light, so it brings out the chiffon, and it's, again, a different type of approach. But there's a very strong statement being made here, which is, when we think of climate change, don't forget people with disability. I talked earlier about the Roma in France. The city government in Strasbourg was so impressed by what these women had done, putting together this quilt, that they gave them housing, jobs, and work permits, which is a huge advance. So it does suggest that this advocacy can work, although our friends at the Council of Europe had to put a lot of work into that, so I'm not sure how replicable it would be. The Srebrenica quilts have been shown very, very widely. And in 2007, we took them to St. Louis, where there's a very large population of Bosnians. And this was the reaction of some of the people. They brought flowers. They put the flowers in front of the quilt. They began to cry. I mean, it was absolutely amazing. They touched that thing, and it took them back to what had happened in their hometown of Srebrenica. Two final thoughts and two slides. The first is that these quilts do not appear to travel back home very well. Now, I don't know whether this is the case, but I took one of the Congo quilts back a couple of years ago, and I showed it to a group of women who had just come into the center. In other words, they had just been through a horrible ordeal. They were completely out of it. They were, I don't know where they were mentally or physically, but they were in very bad shape. And, you know, we tried to explain to them that people who had gone before them had been able to produce a work of art like this. They didn't get it at all. I don't know why. I didn't have the means. I wasn't able to kind of inquire, but they just didn't get it. I suspect it's because they need to spend some time, get used to each other, get used to the project. Just, you know, they'd come straight out of the bush. But it does raise the question of whether these quilts can be used back home by the people who made them. And we don't have an answer to that yet. I hope we'll be able to explore that. Obviously, we would like to, but it suggests to me that the quilts primarily are for use outside as an international tool of advocacy. And then finally, art, income, and sustainability. What we have found, I think, through this project is that there is enormous skill in these communities. And I would venture to say that any community that has been directly impacted has the potential to produce this art. I'm sure I get knocked down by the experts, but there we go. The question is, how can we sustain that? How can we monetize it, to be crude? Because they have no money. These people are poor, dirt poor, most of them. And that's something that we are now addressing and struggling with. In other words, you know, this whole experiment, which I think has gone extremely well up to now, there are many, many questions and, many practical, technical questions that we need to address. But, coming here and talking to a group like you gives me some ideas. And if any of you have questions, I would love to hear them, and maybe we can call on our professors to help us out. But thank you for being patient and listening to me.
When these women are gathered together to do these quilts to help heal themselves, when they have to, are they removed permanently from their original environment? In other words, what happens to them when they go back home?
Well, it's very interesting actually that when we get questions and answers, we have question time about the quilts, and questions like this come up about the specifics, the issues, as opposed to the quilts. So the Congo project, and I'm delighted to talk about this because it's a project we've worked on a lot, and I think emerging from the work in the Congo is a very successful model for dealing with this problem of war rape, which, as you know, is a huge issue for the US government and also for the United Nations. So what happens is many questions about war rape. You know, is it a tactic of war, strategy of war, who does it, how, etc., etc. Bottom line is the women come into the centers, they stay for 3 months. We do not, or men, I say we, our partner does not let husbands into the center. It's all about women with women. After 3 months, they become very nervous because when they were raped, they are almost always abandoned by their husbands. Now, they are more upset about being abandoned by their husbands than they are by being raped. Apparently, the stigma of, there's no such thing as formal divorce, but the stigma of being left by your husband is more oppressive than, which surprised me a lot, than actual rape. So it's a huge challenge to get them back with their husbands, which is what our program attempts to do. We do that by working with the local leaders, the Mwamis. The Mwamis have tremendous influence in these villages, so we get to them first. Somebody from the project, a repatriation officer, accompanies the women back home, talks to the village leader, works with the husband, says to him, listen, your wife was not responsible for this. She needs your help. She needs your protection. And it seems to work. We have a 97% success rate in 4 years. And it's so successful that we're now building on that, using the Mwamis to start going out into communities and promoting women's rights. Parallel to that, we've looked at why these women are being attacked, and we've realized that most of them are attacked when they go out alone to collect water or fuel or cultivate in the fields. So we've rented out land close to the village where they can cultivate together. We've put in a water well. We've developed an alternative form of fuel. We've put in a motorized a machine that will turn their manioc into flour. Anything to lessen the need for them to go out alone where they can get attacked. And again, we seem to see the rates beginning to fall. So there's huge lessons, I think, to be learned from this. It's a pilot program, but it's worked pretty well, and we're actually taking it to Mali this year. We're trying to replicate it. So the quilting project, everything that we've said about the quilts, it's become something of a passion for us, but the real mission here is to address the root causes of marginalization and victimization that causes these problems. I mean, obviously, we do not want the women to be raped. We want to prevent that. I think we may be close.
How did you guys start all this? Like, where did you start with a mission like this, specifically with the quilts?
Right. So how did we come up with the idea? Well, it goes back to the beginning of the presentation. You remember I talked about Bosnia. I went down to Bosnia myself several times during the war, and I met these women who were making these carpets, and then after the massacre of Srebrenica, after the war ended, we went back and we saw that they had mastered the technical skills of weaving on their looms. I had the AIDS quilt in mind. I thought that the AIDS quilt is a very powerful expression, and we suggested it. It was actually one of our volunteers. We do have a fellowship program. I should put in a plug here. If any of you guys would be interested, then you can contact us. We'll send you off to difficult places to do impossible jobs. I mean, bit like going to university, really. But we told our volunteer, we said, why don't you lodge this idea and see if they're interested? And they were, and the rest, they took it from there. And then when we went, for example, I remember going to the Roma encampment in Strasbourg 2 or 3 years later. I took that quilt with me, the Congo quilt. It was pretty weird stuff. I mean, the Roma, I don't know how many of you know about the Roma in Europe, but they are very marginalized people. They make their lives through, I mean, they make their living through begging, prostitution. They're always getting kicked from one place to the other. We've done a lot of work with them. It's a hugely difficult issue. The men were standing around, they were all drunk, you know, and the women got together. We tried to have a discussion in the encampment, and the men kept barging in. So, what's going on here? You know. Anyway, eventually, we pulled out that quilt, that Congo quilt, and we said to them, this is what women in the Congo have done. Now, their situation is a heck of a lot worse than yours. Would you be interested? They loved it. The idea that women in Africa had made something like that. They got it, and they went off and they made their quilt. So, you know, a lot of it travels, I think, by example. They see what other people have done in difficult situations, and they like the challenge. We've only had one failure, and I think that was probably our fault for not explaining a little bit more clearly how it's done. But generally speaking, people get it, and they love it. We've got 3 quilts currently being made this summer by our partner organizations with help from volunteers. One is Peruvian women in the Andes who lost relatives during the Peruvian War. Another is LBTI and transgender people in Western India. And the third is the women in Mali who have also gone through this horrible ordeal of rape. Who knows? I mean, my guess is that they will produce something remarkable. So we're the enablers, and it could easily be anybody else. You just need somebody to help make it happen and to bring their products here to the States and connect them with quilters. And I have to say, I personally love to do it because I love to meet American quilters. These guys are incredibly committed, they're incredibly focused, they're very productive, and they're incredibly creative. They always produce, and that is a dream. So this is a dream job, actually, isn't it, really? Right, so the question was, have we taken this idea to any other groups? For example, groups that are associated with 9/11. Not really. I mean, we have our work cut out, I think, to do justice to our own partners, but we're always open. Saskia at the Noyes Museum, again, who helped to make all of this happen, so big shout out again to Noyes, which is just down the road. I mean, you guys should go and see that museum if you haven't already been there. But Saskia has talked to groups here, and maybe something will come of it. What we were asking a couple of months ago was whether an American group that has suffered from domestic violence or other forms of violence would be interested in taking this up. I mean, this idea is not translated back to the United States yet as a tool of a form of expression and advocacy. Maybe it will. We don't work in this country, we work abroad, but if anybody would be interested in trying to see if that would happen, I think we would certainly help. Well, obviously, it goes without saying, if any of you have any ideas for our project, we would be very interested to hear them. We do take interns to help us down in Washington in our work, but who knows, this may open up some other relationships. Why quilts? Why not pottery? Why not painting? Great question. I mean, I think if the Bosnian women had been making pots, maybe we would have gone in that direction. Again, there's something about embroidery, weaving, carpets, knitting, sewing, textiles, the generic idea, which I think does, it's associated with women, first and foremost. And it sort of emerges from life. It's part of culture. You know, again, we were talking earlier about the designs in Morocco. You remember that slide? The designs in Morocco and Bosnia. I mean, these are designs which are patterns which have been handed down from mother to daughter to mother to daughter. And although I said in Congo, many of those women have not actually used embroidery. Obviously, women do. They knit, they repair clothes. I mean, they're used to dealing with fabric, much more so than pottery or painting. Many of the quilts, or some of the quilts, are paintings onto cloth. And those cloth paintings are then quilted onto backing. So we've had plenty of paintings. It's just that they've been done on cloth. I guess for the sake of consistency more than anything else. We can show the quilts. You know, we could put quilts all the way around this room. So there's a convenience to it. Again, very grateful for the opportunity to talk to you all. I hope you'll all go off and, you know, get those needles going and try not to prick yourselves when you're doing it.
Thank you.